everyone, it's Sophia. So today we're going to be doing part 2 of the Getting Started with React video series. So last time we talked a lot about just sort of the basics of React and how it works on a high level. And so today we're going to be actually doing a demo. So a little bit about me. I'm Sophia and I'm a senior at Brown studying computer science and applied math. And I've worked on a variety of different projects with React, one of which was developing the Hack at Brown website and sort of the front end registration portal. A fun fact about me and Gabby, who filmed the previous segment, is that we're both TAs for the UI UX class at Brown. And so we're super excited to talk about React. We're going to be making a tic-tac-toe board. And so like now that we've gone through all the basics of React and how to set up a React application, we'll be able to demo how to actually do that from scratch. It'll teach you the basics of props, state, and components and how they work together to create an application. And so at the end of this, you'll have a super basic game that you can add on to or sort of adapt into whatever other game you want. This is adapted off of ReactJS's intro tutorial. So we've linked the template code and the solution code down below. And so feel free to check out the solution or template at any point during the video. So with that, we'll just start doing the actual demo. Okay, so let's just get started with the demo. So as with any sort of application that we want to start, we want to install the template code and sort of set up the environment for React development. So let's say we want to create an application called TicTacToe and we want to just save it on our desktop. How we're going to do that is we're just going to go to our terminal and navigate to the folder we want to actually save the application in. So in this case, I'm just going to save it to desktop and save it to a folder called TicTacToe. So to create this React app, we want to run the command npx create react app and then the name of the application. So if we ever want to create some other application of some other name, we always do this command, but just replace it with the name of your application. So in this case, it's TicTacToe. So it'll create all the dependencies, install packages. You can see it's installing some React, the DOM, and then any sort of scripts it needs. So this might take about like 2 minutes. So we'll just let it navigate through. So you'll start here for any sort of application you want to create. If you're trying to build off of an existing application, then you won't need to do this process. You'll just have to install all the code provided to you and then install the dependencies, but this is how you would start from scratch. Okay, so great. So now you'll see that on the desktop, we have this directory structure. And so node modules contains all the sort of dependencies and modules that we use in the application. So if you ever want to install additional packages, you can. Public has the files that are used to render the front end experience, but source is mainly what we're going to be editing. So actually for us, since we have some sort of template code already provided to us, we're going to actually delete all this. And then we're going to go into our TicTacToe file directory, and you'll see that source is currently empty. So we actually want to create a new sort of index.js file and index.css file. So you can just pick any sort of text editor you want. I'm just going to use Atom in this case. Open the project, and we're actually going to create a new file called index.css. And so this is where the template code comes in. We're actually going to install our template code and put in all the necessary text. So this is just styling the tic-tac-toe board. No need to actually understand this. It's not applicable to actually learning React yet. So now we have an index.css file, and then we're also going to similarly create a new file called index.js. And so this also we gave template code to. You'll see in this GitHub link. And this defines all the sort of components that we'll be needing. All right, so we have these two, and then you'll see that this looks basically like JavaScript, but slightly adapted. Before we actually try running our application, we need to install React and tell our application that our application is using React. And so this involves importing React from React. So these lines you'll need in any sort of React application. Import React DOM from React DOM. And then finally, we want to import our CSS file that we just created. So you'll see that this JavaScript file has HTML in it. And so it's essentially saying that any sort of HTML that's found in this JavaScript file is going to be styled using the index.css file that we're importing at the top. So you'll have to do this for any sort of application. So now that we have this, we can navigate back into our terminal, and this is how we'll be able to run our application. So let's just go back out of source, and you'll see that we're back in the TicTacToe directory. And so if we run npm start, it'll run all the React scripts, and then there'll be a bit of a buffer, and you'll see that it's starting the development server. This means that it started the application for creating the front end experience. So it'll be the 3000 port, and so you'll see that it's rendered this tic-tac-toe board. We're going to be mainly focusing on this index.js file. Sort of to explain how this is being rendered, you'll see that there's three main components. There's the square component, the board component, and then the game component. You can think of these as three deconstructed parts of a tic-tac-toe board. That is, like, the tic-tac-toe board is a game that has a board, and each board contains 9 squares. So you can kind of itemize the different elements of the application you're creating, and that's how it breaks down into the different components. And then you'll also notice that each one of these components contains a render method, which returns the HTML that's used to display the contents of the page. So this entire web page is the game React component that renders its HTML, and then you'll see that each one of these has a div that's being styled in order to look like a tic-tac-toe board. The last component that we're going to talk about is the fact that there's this React DOM.render. So this returns the HTML that's used to display the contents of the page. So we're rendering the entire game onto the page. So it's just telling the DOM to put this component onto our actual web page. Following this logic, you'll see that the syntax for rendering the game component is like this, just like how you would see sort of like a div HTML component. We're defining it similarly, except now we have this game component. Now, if we go into the game component, we know that it's rendering this HTML. We see that when we render the HTML of the game component, we also render the board component. If we now go into the render method of board, it's rendering 9 square components, and it's calling this method called this.renderSquare. It's essentially rendering the square that we define in the square component. We'll first tackle the main feature of a tic-tac-toe board, that is being able to click on the board square to mark moves. So let's just ignore the fact that it alternates users, and simply we want to add the feature of just marking an X upon click. So this will deal with each individual square of the board. Therefore, we're going to just look at the square component. In order to sort of think about how state and props are being used in this case, we realize that each square component needs some notion of being clicked. So this can be stored in the state. So just sort of to reiterate this concept, each square component needs to store the notion that it was clicked so that they know to fill it with an X. So what we're going to do is first initialize the state of a square component using a constructor. So in the constructor, the syntax for defining the constructor is going to be constructor props. So this takes any props that we're going to be defining for this component. We'll always need this super props line, and then this is where we define the state. So what we want to do is define the state of the square component. So in this case, we want to define a value, we can call it value, and assign it to null. This value in the state indicates whether the square is an X, an O, or a null. Null would correspond to not being clicked. We want to actually change the render method to actually display the value field here of the square state. So as in, if it's X, we want to actually render an X. If it's an O, we want to render an O. And if it's null, we just want to leave the square empty. So we can do this by going into the render method and looking at the button HTML element. So each sort of tic-tac-toe square can be treated as an individual button. So what we want is to add an on-click function so that upon click, the state gets set to an X. Additionally, we want the text of the button, so what is displayed in the square, to show what we stored in the state. So how we're going to do this is we're going to first define an on-click function. And so on-click, what it'll do is it'll set the state to an X. Since we're ignoring the fact that it needs to alternate, we're just, upon click, it'll always set the state to X since it's being marked. In order to show what is being rendered, so an X or nothing, we actually want to render the text of the button to this.state.value. So we actually want to access the current state and extract what value is. Let's save this and we can see that it's restarting the development server, and let's just try it out. So you'll see that now if we click the different sort of buttons or squares on our board, it'll actually mark the board appropriately. So however, to have a complete game, we need to be able to alternate the placing of the X's and O's, as in if someone already placed an X, the next turn should be an O. And also we want to be able to determine a winner. So if there's ever like 3 across of X's or however, like the different orientations for winning. From our current implementation, we can see that each square saves whether or not it was clicked. However, since the state of the game is determined by a combination of the 9 square states, it probably is more logical to save the state of the entire board. So with this in mind, we sort of want to change the way we develop things, and we want to instead store the board state in the board component state. Just like we store the state in the square component, we now want to actually move that out and actually save the state of the entire game in the board component. What we're going to do is actually define the same constructor. So just like before, we want to do super props, but instead we're going to store an array. So an array of 9 elements, which each element of the array corresponds to the state or sort of the value that each square holds. So if you can imagine, like it would be an array of strings, and if like the first square is marked and the third square is marked, it'll be X, null, O, null, etc., etc. So null corresponds to not being clicked, X is if player X marks the square, and O if the player O marked the square. So just to reiterate this concept, we can see it in code. So we're going to create a value in our state called squares, and this will be an array of 9 elements, and we're just going to fill them with null right now since nothing has been clicked. So before, we marked the square using what was stored in the state of the square component. However, now that the value of each square is stored in this array, we want to first change the render method of the square component so that its text is displayed from the prop titled value that's passed from the parent board. So note that this is different from our original implementation when each square was rendered using the square state. Thus, in our square component, the render function will display a button with text this.props.value. So in our square component, instead of it being the state, it'll be this.props.value. So now in the render square method in the board component, each square is being rendered by this. However, because we have this prop now called value instead of the state, we need to pass the actual prop in. So it'll be this.state.squares, and then it's the I element of this because we want to render the value of this. We actually don't need this constructor anymore in square, and so everything is being rendered using this.props.value. So this will make it so that the text is rendered in each square of either X, O, or nothing based on what is stored in the board state, so this array. But we'll need a way to change what happens when a square is clicked, just like this onClick function, so that the board state can detect this change. So this is how we do sort of callback functions. We need the state of the board to notice any changes when an element in our square component is being changed. We can do this by passing down a function from board to square through props. So this is sort of like a callback function. This can be done by adding a field to the square component in render square. And so now we'll have an onClick function so that on click, it'll call this callback function that we have not yet defined. So it'll be called this.handleClick. So now when a square is clicked, it will call the board's handleClick function. So we have to update the render function of squares so that these changes are appropriately reflected. So because we're passing down this handleClick function from board to square, we also need to assign an onClick function to the button element of the square. So on click, instead of changing the state, what we're going to be actually doing is this dot props dot on click. So it'll call the on click function that's being passed to the square component's props, and calling that to propagate the appropriate changes. So essentially it'll be calling the handle click method that we'll define in the board component. So the handle click function should copy our original board data, so this would be the squares array, and replace the appropriate index with the new value. So in our case, it's X. So handle click, and so it should take in the index of the square we're trying to change. And so first we're going to actually copy the state array since we want it to be immutable. So this dot state dot square dot slice. And then now that we have this array, we can actually go in and edit what squares is at index I. And then we want to reset the state. So set the state of squares to the new squares that we just defined. So now, essentially, we can click the different squares to mark the moves as before, but there still needs to be the functionality to alternate between the X's and O turns. So this can be stored again using the state of the board. We can add in a state value here so that we create a field called X is next. So it's a Boolean that says whether X is next or X is the current turn. So it'll know what to mark. Since X will always be the first turn, we'll say it's true. Every time a player moves, the X is next Boolean will be flipped to determine who goes next. This state will be used in the handle click function to flip the value of X is next every time someone else makes a move and mark the board with the appropriate character. So in here, you'll see that originally we just defined squares I to be X, but we actually want to mark it depending on who is actually next. This is where we use a ternary, which is saying this.state, so it checks if the X is next field in the state is an X. If it's true, that means X is next, so we mark it with an X. But if it's false, we want to mark it with an O. So this is the sort of like a shorthand form of an if-else statement. And then we actually want to set the state of X is next as well. So since X, we just want to sort of flip the direction of the Boolean, we can just negate our original. If we now try rendering this, okay, wait. So now if we try rendering, oops, some errors. Let's fix these first. 31. So squares. You'll probably have to deal with these errors. React does a really nice thing of showing the errors. So you'll see that first we click X and now it'll switch the order and it'll be O. And then it'll go on like that. Okay, great. So now we have that. Now we finally want to be able to determine the winner. So we'll be using a function called calculate winner. It's just a helper function that you'll see in the template code to actually calculate the winner based on the board state. In this case, it's taking in the array of sort of like our board, which is stored in the state. Essentially, it'll return an X, an O, or a null as the winner based on the board array. What we want to do is upon each click of the board, we want to determine whether the square has either already been clicked or there already is a winner. So if either are true, then we don't want to do anything with the click. So we don't want to display anything. In our handle click function, we'll have to add in a condition to check whether or not these are fulfilled. In here, before we mark anything, we want to actually check if calculate winner of squares, if there actually is a winner or it's already been marked. In these cases, then we just want to return because nothing needs to be marked. Otherwise, we want to actually change the state and mark the appropriate square. Similarly, we can also display the status of the game to either show a winner or the next player to go, depending on the sort of things that we're storing in state. And so if we go to the render method of board, you'll see that there's a status. What we're going to do is first see what the winner is. So the winner should just be what calculate winner returns. So it should take in the state of the current board. And then we're actually going to ignore this and define a status. So if there is a winner, then we want to set the status to winner is the current winner that we just defined. Otherwise, we want to set the status to be the next player is going to be either this.state.x is next. If x is next, then the next player will be x, obviously, and if not, it should be O. So this handles the different cases. Actually, there's a bit of a typo. You'll see that first the next player should be x. So x goes, and then it'll change to O. And then let's say like x wins. Or let's have O win. You'll see that it display the winner being O. So now we have this working game of tic-tac-toe. It's very bare bones. So there are a bunch of other additions that you can make, such as displaying the history of all the moves made so that users can move back in time. This is a very common feature for a lot of different games. You can play around with this and make use of your new knowledge of state props and components. So this is just like a very bare bones app, but it uses all of these concepts in order to develop an application. Thanks for watching our video on the intro to React. Hope everything made sense. So be sure to like and subscribe, comment if you have any questions, and just a reminder, we post videos every Monday. So hope you look forward to the next one.